Welcome to my American History Notes, where I talk about the conclusions I've drawn from studying American history, conclusions which you might not agree with, you might even be offended by. But the important thing is that you have your own opinion and you do know about these people, places, events, times, concepts, to be conversant in American history, to know even more than I'm talking about. It's just a survey, it's a surface thing. And many of you out there will know a great deal about a specific person or a specific event like the Civil War, for instance, slavery, whatever, Jim Crow laws, civil rights movement. You'll know about that more than I would. But I just want to make sure people like me, common everyday people, not scholars, have an understanding of American history and are conversant in it. So we're going to begin today with some important figures of Reconstruction. Now, there were some African Americans, some Black Americans who really affected the course of American history during Reconstruction. And this lasted from 1865 to 1877, um, when Black Americans gained political, well, particularly male, because we hadn't got to female rights yet. Um, American men, African American men, gained new political and legal rights, and they were implemented with the federal government involved, like soldiers in the South, Union soldiers, American soldiers. There was a number of activists. They kind of redefined how Black Americans would interact in politics, society, and culture, especially in the South. You have Hiram Revels, Robert Elliott, and Joseph Rainey. They were some of the characters that were part of a Black political leadership during this time. And they accomplished many significant things in spite of the fact of facing racism, being undermined by Southern whites who felt threatened by the fact that Black citizens, were newly empowered. They made a lot of gains in Reconstruction, but those were rolled back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But the actions of these early African American leaders inspired those who followed them, like the Ford political family of Tennessee. I believe it's Tennessee. We see Harold Ford Jr. He was a congressman, and his father and relatives all the way back for a century or more. These are people that that had some impact on them from these original Black leaders. Now, although the slaves were freed at the end of the Civil War, they weren't given legal and political rights under President Andrew Johnson. During the very beginning of Reconstruction, the Black Americans formed things like equal right leagues in the South to try to demand equality under the law, like the right to vote. To fight oppressive, what I called earlier, I mentioned Black codes, and there was laws that restricted the newly freed African Americans in various ways. So from 1867 to 77, excuse me, was a period known as radical Reconstruction, where Black Americans got a lot of basic rights from Congress, such as official citizenship. Yeah, the Dred Scott case had said that Blacks weren't citizens. The right to vote. As more African Americans were allowed to participate in the political life of the United States, there was organizations like the Union League that supported Black political activism in the South. And then in 1867, Blacks began to take part in state constitutional conventions for the first time, and the majority of Republican voters in the South were Black. During Reconstruction, about 2,000 or more African American men served in political office. Many hundreds of Blacks held local offices in the South, and more than 600 were elected to state legislatures, and 16 served in Congress. So if you to take these posts to actually assume what they've been voted to, they often had to win elections that were plagued by violence and fraud. Yeah, American elections have always been plagued by fraud, at least, and often violence. Southern whites used a lot of forms of intimidation to oppose Black voters, politicians, policies, and rights, like the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, and other white supremacy organizations. They attacked Republican leaders and at Black Americans during this period. They killed at least 35, that's recorded, Black officials who've been elected. Now, one of the most important or influential Black leaders during Reconstruction was Hiram Revels. He was the first Black American, excuse me, the first Black American who was elected to serve in the U.S. Senate. Revels was from the state of Mississippi. Um, He had required leadership experience in the church and the Union Army. He had been born free in North Carolina. He was educated in Illinois. He was a preacher in the Midwest, and he was the chaplain of a black regiment in the Union Army. He went to Mississippi in 1865 and worked for the Freedmen's Bureau. In January of 1870, Revels was elected to the U.S. Senate by the Mississippi State Legislature to complete the term of a seat left vacant since the Civil War. When he was elected, he was widely praised. His biography and personal life were published in newspapers across the country, like the Wisconsin State Register, the Little Rock, Arkansas Morning Republican, and the Dover Gazette and Stafford Advisor. He was applauded and heralded as a man of much energy and character with excellent, well-developed mental qualifications. And his person is centered one of the grandest thoughts, one quote, as the 19th century, the equality of all men before the law. And he only served one. He was replaced by a white Republican and a former Confederate general. He served one 6-year term. So Revels and other black politicians like Robert Elliott, Joseph Rainey, these men did not have the same power as white politicians, but they did have influence. They did have experience often, like Elliott. You know, Elliott was he had strong oratory skills. He was elected at 1868 state convention in South Carolina. He was one of 78 black delegates. He was known for his oratory skills and his passionate support for education. And then you had Joseph Rainey, also from South Carolina. He's the first African American to serve in the House of Representatives. He was a member from 1870 to 1879. That was the longest tenure of any African American legislature during Reconstruction. He also became the first black man to preside over a session of the House in 1874, April of 1874. Now, he was born into slavery. His father bought his family's freedom when Rainey was a child. He had a limited education, but he was trained as a barber. Then he was forced to serve in the Confederate Army until he and his family escaped Bermuda. He came back after the Civil War and became active in Republican politics. Shortly thereafter, he was elected to complete a congressional term for U.S. Representative, who resigned due to a scandal. He won several subsequent elections, and he had controversy. He advocated for both black and white constituents. He wasn't just focused on black people, but he focused especially on civil rights. So he was politically active all the way through, even after rights were taken back, and so. In an open letter to Rainey, excuse me, and other participants in, he took part in a Cleveland conference in 1881 of black men organizing a push for African American rights. And the newly elected president, James Garfield, wrote in an open letter to Rainey and other participants published in the Lynchburg, Virginia, and Arthur St. A. Smith wrote, I'm sorry, the letter wasn't from James Garfield, it was from Arthur Smith. He wrote, and I quote, "Gentlemen, let me say that if you, the present leaders of our people, do not secure some substantial recognition at the hands of General Garfield, you might as well take back seats, for you, gentlemen, at least, can never rally the Negroes to the Republican polls again." So there were some very important black people, men that participated in politics during Reconstruction. When there was a possibility of blacks being educated, there was a possibility of them fully participating in the federal government. And then what happens next is a betrayal of African Americans at the end of Reconstruction. We're going to talk some more about these topics as we continue with a couple more sessions on Reconstruction and what happens at the end of the 1800s. So I thank you for listening. Understand, these men were not stupid. They were not passing laws they couldn't read. There may have been people. I mean, we have congressmen today that say dumb things. I heard a congressman a few years ago, believe it or not, I saw this on C-SPAN, where he was concerned that Guam might tilt over the island because we put so many troops there. I've heard congressmen say things about topics they knew nothing about, Republican and Democrat. Get up and say stuff. And if you watch C-SPAN enough, you'll hear somebody that's leading us say something, and you go, what the, what the what? As Akbar Bajabiamila says on American Ninja Warrior, what the what? There's some politicians Just because they're elected officials doesn't mean they have any understanding of a certain topic that they're faced with. So, just to say, well, the fact is that that's a myth that that Reconstruction allowed a bunch of dummies who were black to rule in Southern legislatures and politics. Certainly, there were people who weren't qualified. There always are, but there were many people who were trained, educated, had experience in church, the army, had been spokesmen, and were just as good a politician, as good a representative as any white person. So get that out of your head about Reconstruction and study it more. There's a lot of good scholarly books out there, not books written by one side or the other that are going rah, rah, rah for what I believe, but scholarly books where they examine primary sources, news articles, letters, journals, diaries, accounts, that are right there, people that were there. So I thank you for watching, and we're going to continue on this topic next time.